Australia's greatest bank robbery. Let me begin with a quote. Somewhere near the water's edge, in one of the small bays on the north shore of Sydney Harbour, lies buried several boxes of Spanish dollars and Georgian silver coins, part of the proceeds of the infamous Bank of Australia robbery. According to historical records, these have never been found. Buried treasure. It's two simple words, but somehow they manage to evoke a sense of mystery and adventure, excitement in all of us. Perhaps even images of swashbuckling pirates and tattered maps and boxes of glittering gold coins. Yet, really, when you think about it, the last time pirates came to Sydney Harbour was when Johnny Depp and Captain Jack Sparrow and his gang appeared at the IMAX Theatre, unless, of course, you include Eddie Obeid's recent appearance at the ICAC hearing. Pirates were not responsible for this particular treasure. For the story of this robbery, we need to go back to the bad old days of Sydney's past, when anything in the way of criminal exploits had to be particularly daring to excite much astonishment in a community of thieves. Back to the year 1828, in fact. Sydney was a hubbub of noise and activity, ships arriving from all over the world, merchants calling out their wares, convicts rattling their chains, and through the cacophony came a shout. "The Bank of Australia has been robbed." Everyone pricked up their ears. "How?" cried some people. "How much?" cried others. But before I discuss this anymore, I need to actually take you back another 40 years to set the historical scene, back to the time when New South Wales was first settled. There were no bank robberies in those days, mainly because there were no banks, but also because there was no money. As incredible as it might sound, the powers that be that dispatched the 11 ships of the First Fleet with the 1,500 souls on board forgot to send any money with it. They also forgot to send spare clothes for the women, spare shoes for everyone, and even enough ammunition, which is particularly strange when you're considering it's a penal settlement in a colony surrounded by aggrieved Aboriginal people. It actually rather reminds me of my ordinary shopping trips, because I always managed to go to the shops without the shopping list or the shopping bags, and I have to make a guess at it, but at least I am not 18,000 miles from home. The only place they could replenish any of these goods was either in Chile or Indonesia. You couldn't just buy them at the local store. It's amazing that the settlement survived. It's amazing that we are all here. Part of the problem was Britain's attitude. They were desperate to get rid of the convicts filling up their dilapidated old jails. They believed that criminals were born, not made, that they chose to commit crimes rather than work for their living. So they figured the best way to get rid of crime from society was to chop off this diseased limb of society and either send it to the gallows, which really permanently got rid of it, and they would have loved to do that for everyone, of course, every criminal, but they couldn't do so. The other alternative was to send them as far from home as it was possible to send them, far enough away, hopefully, that they wouldn't be able to return. Not just banishment, but vanishment. And it's actually, I've sometimes rather wondered whether that was what Julia Gillard had in mind when she made Kevin Rudd Minister of Foreign Affairs. They'd forgotten to ask themselves how the convicts would support themselves after their sentences had expired. And many of the sentences expired a couple of years after they arrived in New South Wales. Rum became the medium of exchange, and the people who profited most from this trade in rum were the officers of the New South Wales Corps, which became known, not surprisingly, as the Rum Corps. The officers themselves would later become known as the Gentlemen of Sydney, which will become relevant also down the track. When Governor Bligh attempted to thwart their power, we had the Rum Rebellion. And interestingly, at the ICAC hearing, the prosecution said of Eddie Obeid's activities that they revealed a scale of corruption unrivalled since the days of the Rum Corps. The relevance of that comment will become obvious as this story unfolds. Governor Macquarie arrived in 1810 with a clean broom. He recognised so many of the problems in the colony, including the issues with the colonial currency. There were many coins in circulation by then, pound sterling coins, but also coins from countries all over the world, American eagles, Indian rupees, Spanish dollars, you name it. But there was no system in the way the currency flowed. So he recognised that we needed our own currency. He purchased 10,000 pounds of Spanish dollars. He punched the hole in the centre and we got the holy dollar in the dump, our first colonial currency. But there were still issues. There was no regulated exchange rate, no credit facilities for business. So in 1817, he established the Bank of New South Wales. It would later become known as the People's Bank. But it's important to remember that New South Wales was still a penal settlement. There were convicts arriving on convict ships every couple of months, sometimes more frequently. A bank in a penal settlement of thieves, because most of them were thieves. If they'd committed any more serious crimes, they were hanged in Britain. It was like putting a Krispy Kreme shop on the set of The Biggest Loser. As it turned out, it was 11 years before a bank was robbed. And it wasn't the Bank of New South Wales that was robbed. It was the Bank of Australia, what had become known as the Gentleman's Bank. Governor Macquarie didn't think much of the gentlemen of Sydney. He once expressed his disgust in this way. New South Wales comprised two groups of people, he said, those sent out here as convicts and those who should have been. No doubt he had in mind a man called Richard Brooks, among others. Brooks was captain of the convict ship the Atlas that arrived in New South Wales in 1802. Brooks partitioned off part of the convicts' quarters and filled it with goods that he could sell for profit on his arrival. In the convicts' confined quarters, disease ran rife. A third of the convicts died on the voyage. This compared to most other transports around that time, where there were only a handful of deaths, if any at all. Brooks wasn't punished. He was even allowed to be the captain of another convict transport later on. Yet compare this treatment with that of the convicts themselves. They could get hung for stealing 5 shillings of goods from a shop. They could get hung for cutting down a tree in an avenue, because this was the portal into the gentlemen's estates. Such were the iniquities and inequities of the colonial judicial system, as the convicts well knew. The gentlemen of Sydney were not happy by the 1820s with how the Bank of New South Wales worked. They were disgusted at having to sit on the board of the bank shoulder to shoulder with rich convicts. And they also felt that the bank wasn't doing enough to help them profit from the then economic boom. So they took their ball and they decided to set up their own bank, the Bank of Australia, the Gentleman's Bank, it would soon become known. Thomas McVitie was the manager of the bank, and one of his duties was to provide premises for the bank. So he had to find something that would be suitable for the business potential. But what he found wasn't just suitable for the business. It was like a narrative in its own, a warning to would-be thieves. If I had PowerPoint facilities, I'd be able to show you a picture of the bank and where exactly it was situated. But without that, you'll just have to make do with a description, a verbal description. I'm sure most of you have taken a trip from Wynyard Station in the city down George Street to the Rocks. You have? Yep. Okay. Let's take this journey with you. You go past Hunter Street on the right, keep heading north and you go past Bridge Street. Keep heading north again and you reach a point where George Street doglegs. Immediately to the left is Essex Street going up the hill. The bank was positioned at that dogleg on the right side of George Street, on the Sydney Cove side of George Street. The building that is there now is called Union House. Some of you might know that building. So what's so significant about this location? Immediately next door to the bank was the pub and house of the ex-Chief Constable of Sydney. The pub itself was called Keep Within Compass. What compass, you might ask? The moral compass, which seems particularly ironic considering that this was a pub selling the alcohol that made the people drunk, that it was actually lecturing them against in its name, the name and the picture on the sign. But such were the ways of Sydney. Just down the road to the south was the military barracks. Directly opposite the bank was Sydney Jail. And Essex Street itself, it was then known as Gallows Hill. Such was the significance of the bank's location. The building itself was established, just built as a house. McVitie needed a vault for his bank, so he needed it built in the sandstone under the building itself. If you were a bank manager in need of a vault, would you employ a known thief to build the vault for you? I don't think you would. But McVitie had very few choices at the time. The year 1828, 50% of the population were either convicts or ex-convicts. The remainder were the officers, like the governor, the military, the merchants and farmers and wives and children. The trade skills lay within the convict classes. So McVitie made the best of a bad option. He chose the best stonemason in Sydney, a man called Thomas Turner, who was the overseer of the government stonemasons. But let's put this in perspective. McVitie was putting a convicted thief in charge of building a supposedly secure bank vault. It was like putting a fox in charge of the hen house. But wait, there's more. It gets worse. If you were a bank manager picking a building for your bank premises, surely you would walk around the building and have a good look at its location. And surely you would notice the alley that ran down immediately beside the building, which was because of its position at this dogleg. They had to have a gap. And surely if you did walk down this alley, you would notice a grating in the alley. And surely if you noticed that grating, you would notice the unpleasant odour that wafted out of the grating. And surely you would think to ask what it was. And if you had asked, you would find out that it was a rainwater cum sewerage drain that ran from Essex Hill down under George Street, beside this building, and down with its outlet at Sydney Cove. And if you discovered that, surely you would think to ask who might have built the sewerage drain. The answer? Thomas Turner. McVitie, in professional terms, was guilty of a failure of due diligence. Or in other terms, he was an idiot. I mean, what possessed him not to look at the area closely? Did he think, okay, I'm not going to worry about this much. We're in a penal settlement. Yes, they might be thieves, but they've got to be really lousy thieves because they've been caught and they've been transported out here. But sometimes they say when somebody goes to jail for whatever crime, it's like enrolling them in stealing 101. They get better while they're in jail rather than learning their ways. Well, what happens when you send them to a penal settlement where your neighbours are all thieves, your spouses are thieves, even the policemen patrolling the streets are thieves? It's like enrolling them in free postgraduate studies. And do you seriously think that the local conversation at the pub, as everyone gets a bit drunk because that's how they got pleasure, in those days, was how much they gave at the local church offertory? No, it was how audacious their crimes had been. Evidently, McVitie failed to remember the tale of the scorpion and the frog. Have you heard this tale? The scorpion wants to get across the swollen river. So he says to the frog, will you take me over on your back? And the frog says, you wouldn't sting me, would you? And the scorpion says, no, of course I wouldn't. If I did, we'd both drown. Halfway across the river, the scorpion stings the frog. And the frog says, what did you do that for? And the scorpion said, because it's in my nature. Even if it wasn't in Thomas Turner's nature, he had a grudge against the government. He'd arrived as a convict about a dozen years before, at a time under Governor Macquarie when many of the convicts were getting tickets of leave, the colonial version of a parole pass, within a year or two or three of their arrival, but not Thomas Turner. He was a very good stonemason and the government wanted to keep him in their services. He was responsible, amongst others, in building St James Church and Macquarie Tower. And even the architect, another convict, Francis Greenway, said he was a genius. Turner had appealed over and over to the government to get some of these indulgences, but he'd been ignored and rejected. So he was angry. And what he did when he built this vault was he made some measurements. But he knew if the vault was robbed, he would be the obvious suspect. So he sat on these measurements and sat on his knowledge for a couple of years. And eventually in 1828, he revealed all. He, an English-born Protestant stonemason, gave the details to a group of Irish Catholic shoemakers. That one I can't quite work out, other than to think he must have thought that they were about as different to him as it was possible to be, given the social and religious divide in the colony at the time, and that they were the last people who would be expected to be his accomplices. He told them that they would need the services of a skilled blacksmith to build some tools for them, to help them getting into the vault. It wasn't hard for them to think of the most skilled and the most criminally inclined blacksmith in Sydney, a man called William Blackstone, who would become the protagonist of my book, Breaking the Bank. So Blackstone naturally accepted the job, and he set to work making the tools, and they made their plans. Let's just put this into perspective. We've all seen bank robbery movies and crime thriller movies, so we've all got some idea. Here, this group of men were attempting to break in to the most secure facility in the colony, run by the most powerful men in the colony. It was a bit like the CIA break-in scene in Mission Impossible. Instead of Tom Cruise and his trapeze artists, we have a group of paddy cobblers armed with the latest top secret technology in silent stonemasonry. 2 jointers and a gimlet. But it was technological indeed. In fact, Blackstone, who was very proud of his tools, would later boast that they made no more noise than a mouse snoring. So, on the last Saturday of August 1828, in the early hours of the morning, just before dawn, the men went down to the drain entrance at Sydney Cove. James Dingle, the ringleader, had gone down and done a reconnaissance job during daylight hours during the week, and he'd found the entrance, so he knew where they had to go. And they went to the entrance to this drain, and they stood there and they looked, and they saw that out of the drain was slowly streaming a 6-inch high stream of, let's call it, sludge. I don't think I need to tell you what exactly this sludge consisted of or what it smelt like. Fortunately, it was August. It wouldn't smell as bad as it would in February. And just imagine what they thought when they looked at this. Now, I don't know what you would think, but I thought, well, what would I think? And I'd be going, oh, I hope this is really worth it. So what they did is, it was about waist high. So bent over like arthritic old men, they shuffled through the sludge and started to make their way up the sewerage drain, which ran a gentle slope up the hill, up towards the top of Essex Hill. I always think it's funny, we tend to think of Sydney as flat, but whenever you walk around it, you realise it's actually quite steep. The sides go up quite steeply, so of course ideal for the rainwater washing some of the sewerage drain down. As they shuffled their way up the drain, they realised that they came to some spots where there was a bit of diffused light from above, and that the sludge was thicker and smellier at that point. And they realised something very important. When you all leave here today, you will no doubt go home to your nice bathrooms with the clean tiles and the air freshener, and you'll hope that the males of the household will have put the seat down, and you will perform your duties and you will flush the toilet and you'll forget about it all. You won't think anything about what happened to it afterwards. Of course, in those days it was quite different. They had sheds and they had dunny cans and they had nightmen whose responsibility it was to get rid of their own personal sludge. But there were a few people along the line of the drain who had a sudden realisation of their own, that they had a much easier way of getting rid of it, that they would just tunnel down into the drain itself and then stick their necessary, as it was called, on top of this hole, and they could just go to the necessary and it would all be gone and they wouldn't have to think about it anymore. Which meant that as these men were shuffling through the sewerage up the drain and they came to these spots, they realised that they might choose the moment when somebody up above decided to go and use the necessary, and just as they went to walk underneath, somebody might be sitting there, and if that happened, they would be in very great danger of being heard. They realised they had to find some other way of getting into the drain. So they kept on shuffling, and the wash of fresh air and the bit of light indicated they'd reached the drain grating, which is where they needed to start. Thomas Turner had given them some measurements that they needed to use from where the drain grating was. So they made the measurements, and as dawn's light started to penetrate the drain, they started digging. They had 9 feet of bricks, rubble, rocks, and then the big foundation stones of the vault to get through. So it was going to be a lot of work. They started digging and they dug until lunchtime, when they decided to have some lunch, which begs the thought, what exactly had they done with it? The drain was only waist height, as I said. It didn't exactly have shelves or coat hooks. What had they done with their coats? What had they done with the bottles of grog, the rum they carried? What had they done with their sandwiches or whatever they took to eat? And did they wash their hands? The mind rather boggles, doesn't it? It doesn't really bear thinking about. So they ate their stuff and they continued tunnelling in the afternoon, and after dark, as it got dark, they ate the rest of their food and waited for a couple of hours until it got very dark and the population would dissipate. And then they came out at the other location they had found, where they didn't need to walk underneath the necessaries. They made a plan then to meet the following Saturday, because the only day the men could tunnel was a Saturday. On the other days of the week, the 5 weekdays, they all worked. Blackstone and Farrell, 2 of the robbers, were serving convicts. While they were allowed to live outside the Hyde Park Barracks, just in normal housing, they had to attend a roll call, what was called a church muster on the Sunday. They had to attend church and then be mustered at the same time. So they couldn't tunnel on the Sunday because they had to attend the muster. So Saturday was the only day they could do it. So they tunnelled the first Saturday and the second Saturday and the third Saturday, and all went fine until about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when one of the big foundation stones that was resting at the top of the rubble tumbled down the rubble, and it smashed into Blackstone's hand. He was holding a hot lantern at the time, and it smashed the lantern into his hand and burnt his skin, at which of course he screamed and the rock thundered. And when they looked up, they could see the floorboards of the house above and the light piercing the floorboards, and they knew that it happened to be the house of the ex-Chief Constable of Sydney, the last place they wanted to be known. So they went very quiet and they waited to see if anyone would come to check out the noise, and no one did. So they just waited there and did nothing until dark, and then they got themselves out of the drain and found the ringleader, who of course had kept himself out of the drain for security purposes, so he could see what was going on. But I think he was clever enough to know that it was best not to be down there, just in case they were caught. Dingle, the ringleader, decided that he didn't want to delay the tunnelling. The only day they could actually rob the bank was on a Sunday, because the bank works 6 days a week. So the only day no one would be going down to the vault was the Sunday. So they had a problem. They had to finish the tunnelling, and 2 of the robbers had to attend church muster, but the only day they could do that was a Sunday. So Dingle said, "It's all right, I know the muster clerk. I will bribe him to say that you were there." So on the Sunday morning, the men went down to the drain again, and they continued tunnelling, and they were just reaching the big foundation stone when they heard the steady drum, the tattoo of the drum calling them all to muster, the hypnotic pull that anyone would be foolhardy to resist. The next moment they heard coins tinkling through the drain grating, scared the living daylights out of them for a moment until they realised it was Dingle's warning, or Dingle's assurance that he had bribed the muster clerk and it was fine to go ahead with the robbery. So they used their tools and they pulled out one of the big foundation stones, the cornerstone, and the littlest robber, the slenderest one, George Farrell, slithered through, and he began pulling out the tin boxes of notes and the bags of coins. The men sat in the drain. They actually had used the bricks from the drain to build a causeway, so they didn't have to sit in the sludge by then. And they sat on the causeway and they checked all the notes out because they knew the last thing they needed was to be found with any seriously damaged notes in their possession or any notes that were uncirculated. So they checked the notes thoroughly and they put them all in by denomination and kept on working. Then Blackstone looked up and he noticed in the gloom one of the other robbers was squatting down, partially undressed, over one of the tins that had held the money. And he called out, "You are a scoundrel," to this man. And the man, a man named Creighton, said, "What does it signify?" And Blackstone said, "I can see no utility in aggravating the offence by insult." Creighton grabbed one of the uncirculated notes and taunted, "I will have the pleasure of making use of this." Then he threw the soiled note into the tin and pulled up his trousers, and they left the tin in the drain when they left there that night with all the notes and the stolen coins. The news broke at about 10 a.m. the next morning. Can you imagine the shouts, the yells of anguish? The police came and they slithered through the drain, the hole into the drain, where they found the tools, yeah right, Blackstone they immediately thought, where they found the empty rum bottles and where they found the tin with Creighton's deposit in it. And you can just imagine, can't you? I mean, if any of you watch CSI and programs like that, you can just imagine Lawrence Fishburne coming along with his crap analysis kit and taking some stool samples to get some DNA analysis for checking it out and trying to work out who the robbers were. But of course, they had no means of determining who had committed a crime in those days. They had no fingerprints, and of course, they had no DNA analysis. All they had was catching the person in the act or somebody revealing all. So they had nothing they could go on except their suspicions at that point. So how much money had the men stolen? £14,000 in notes and coins. It was enough to break the bank. Of course, you're all probably wondering how much £14,000 is in today's money. This was something I had to work out for myself when I was writing the book. So I did some Googling, isn't the internet wonderful, looking for conversion rates. And I found this fascinating site that gave 5 different conversion rates. The rate that most people use when they're doing a historical conversion is essentially a basket of goodies rate. They take staple items, milk, bread, that sort of thing, and they work out the cost of them then and they work out the cost of them today, and they use that to generate a conversion. And that's what's customarily used. But there was a bit of a problem with this. It worked out at about 100 times was the conversion. So the conversion of the £14,000 times 10 was 140 times 100, was 1.4 million. But I had a problem with this because I knew that £14,000 was an awful lot of money in those days. And I also knew that Vaucluse House had sold the previous year. For how much? £1,500. Multiply that by 100, you've only got $150,000. Now, everyone, I'm sure, of us would be pitching to buy Vauclu's house at $150,000. There was something wrong with this conversion rate. So I had a look again, and there was one that was a wages conversion rate. And I thought, this sounds more reasonable. And it was 1,000 times, essentially, a bit more than that. So this £14,000 became essentially about $20 million. That was more like it. That was the sort of huge amount of money they'd stolen. Until I mentioned it to a friend of mine who was a CEO of a superannuation company. He said, $20 million is not enough to break a bank these days. And then I told him about the GDP conversion rate, which is the fifth of the conversion rates, which essentially gave a guide to how much that money was worth in terms of the economic activity of the community. The GDP conversion rate, $6 billion. And he said, that's more like it. That's the sort of money that broke Lehman Brothers, Salomons, the Bank of Scotland. That's the sort of money that ushered in the tidal wave that was the global financial crisis. We're talking about a big haul, way the biggest in Australia. Imagine the fury of the governor. This happened on his watch. But he actually wasn't worried about the economic impact. It was the message. He was the governor of a penal settlement. The intention was punishment and deterrence, not just to all the convicts in New South Wales, but of course their criminal cohorts in England and any wannabe thieves in England. The idea was that transportation was supposed to be so horrible that no one would commit crimes because they wouldn't want to be sent out to Australia. And he knew that the impact of the message this could have on the convicts when the newbies arrived in New South Wales and they said to the old lags, what's it like here? The old lags would say, you can rob a bank and get away with it. It wasn't the message he wanted. And what about the bank managers themselves? They had no insurance for the money. They had no lists of the notes stolen. The cunning rogues had probably beggared them, until one of them had a great idea. Banknotes today, of course, are issued by the government, but in those days they weren't. They were essentially promissory notes, promises to pay, and they were issued by each individual bank. So this clever mind thought, okay, what we'll do is we'll print new notes and we will get everyone in the colony to bring back their old Bank of Australia notes, and we will get them to say when and where they got the notes. If we looked in our wallets today, we'd look at the notes and say we have no idea when or where we got that note. Well, unless we had a $100 note, and the odds are we got that from Medicare, when it was giving notes out anyway. And so we wouldn't know it, but you've got to compare it with those days. The largest banknote then was £50. The average wage, less than £50. The average wage today, about $65,000. If we had a $65,000 note in our wallet, we would know exactly when and where we got the note. So it was a clever idea, but he failed to think of two things. First, it was a penal settlement. Many of the inhabitants were still thieves. They couldn't come along to the bank with the policeman in the corner, and when they said, where and when did you get the note, say, I stole it from Joe Bloggs down the road last Saturday. That wouldn't work. The second point was the community's attitude. The editor of the Liberal Monitor newspaper assessed the attitude and wrote, such are the unpopular and impolitic principles on which the Bank of Australia was originally founded by Mr. John MacArthur and his adherents, that among the bulk of Sydney's inhabitants, the bank's loss has created secret and in many cases open satisfaction. With remarkable prescience, he added, we feel greatly afraid that facility rather than impediment will be given to the circulation of the stolen notes to such a degree as will prevent detection. He was right. He'd picked up the anger in the colonial community against the gentry of Sydney and the authorities generally. And he realised that these people would see this as a wonderful opportunity to do the bird to the authorities. And just think about it today. I mean, just think about our attitudes today. Would it be that different? We all love to hate the banks. They put up interest rates instantly. They bring them down really slowly, if at all. They charge exorbitant rates and make exorbitant profits with absurd penalties. Just imagine if Gina Reinhardt had a bank. Would we all be saying, oh, poor Gina if it was stolen, if it was heavily robbed? Would we all saying, poor Gina, I'll do everything to help her get her money back? No, I think probably many of us would be saying, like the newspaper said, it would be feeling secret or open satisfaction. And just imagine if some of the notes started circulating at the local swimming carnival and the people knew that there was no chance of getting caught. And they might just say, I'll take that one because you've got $29 billion, which was founded on inherited wealth. Yet you had the hide to intimate that the rest of us should be willing to work for $2 a day. And I'll take that one because you were happy to take our metals without paying any dues for the metals. And I'll take that one because you're so horrible to your children. And maybe I'll leave that one because clearly, despite your $29 million, you don't have enough to get a decent haircut. So I think many of us would be quite happy if some of the banks basically got it right up their own vault. But there was one person who was willing to give some information. He had his suspicions. He was the bribed muster clerk at the church. He was what was called a special, an educated convict. So he didn't really fit in with the rest of the community. And he thought, jointers and gimlets, skilled blacksmith, Blackstone missed the church muster, Farrell, yeah, probably the type to get involved with this. So he signed a statement to the authorities listing 5 names, Blackstone and Farrell, and 3 other men who were actually innocent. All 5 of them were serving convicts, so they were all thrown into jail without any proper charges laid against them. The authorities realised, though, that the words suspicions of this man, just because these men had missed a muster, didn't mean that they had committed the bank robbery. So there wasn't enough to take them to trial. They needed either one of the receivers or one of the robbers to reveal all. The receivers didn't. Many people got caught with stolen notes. Not a single person said where they got them from or even communicated their suspicions. And none of the other robbers revealed all either, despite being in jail. Blackstone and Farrell knew that their actual sentences of servitude to New South Wales were to expire the following year. So if they kept mum for long enough, the government would have to release them. And in 1829 it did. The 3 other men the innocent men actually remained in jail for a few more years. As for the other robbers, one had taken the booty, the spoils of the robbery, and fled the country. He was a sensible one. One, Creighton, who'd left his deposit in the tin in the drain, he'd actually drowned in Sydney Harbour. Interesting story in itself. The ringleader had managed to rip off Blackstone, and Blackstone was also had been ripped off by one of the receivers. He'd taken his own notes too. So Blackstone wasn't happy. Blackstone was also a really rotten thief, but he never managed to work out that he was a better blacksmith. One day, shortly after his release from jail, he committed another crime and he was convicted and sentenced to be transported to the hellhole of the Norfolk Island penal settlement. The bank robbery investigator came to the ship that was about to take him to Norfolk Island and offered him a deal. If he was willing to reveal all about the bank robbery, he would get immunity for that crime and pardon for the crime that was about to send him to Norfolk Island. But Blackstone said, nah, and he blithely sailed off to Norfolk Island. Norfolk Island was one of the worst places in the world at that moment. The convict authorities set it up as the ne plus ultra of convict penal settlements. So you can imagine regular floggings, shocking food, harsh conditions, 2 years, 10 years, life. Many of them were going to be there for a very long time. They made up a game to help them deal with the conditions. And you know the situation, you grab a whole lot of straws, you cut them into lengths, a whole lot the same length with one taller and one shorter. Well, they got a group of people got together, did this, handed out the straws, and when they checked them, the one with the longer straw then murdered the one with the shorter straw. The victim had just escaped from Norfolk Island. The murderer would escape from Norfolk Island through being hung, but there was no criminal court on Norfolk Island, so they would all have to be taken back to Sydney to be tried. And during that journey, there was just the slightest chance that they might escape from the authorities. And even the reprieve from being on Norfolk Island was worth it. Blackstone wasn't one of the members of one of these gangs, but he was a witness when another convict found an opening with one of the hated convict collaborators. He was a witness, essentially, to another murder. He was brought back to Sydney as part of the witnesses to the trial, and at that point, that same robbery investigator came back to the jail and offered the same deal to Blackstone. 2 years on Norfolk Island, he said, "Thanks, I'll take it." And that is the only reason we know about the amazing Bank of Australia robbery, because of his signed depositions in the aftermath. History has the best stories. The stories aren't just wonderful stories in their own right, but they can give us incredible insights into human nature. Think about it in terms of business potential. McVitie, as we said, really didn't do a good job in thinking about the location of his bank vault. And it does make you wonder how many other bank managers are guilty of the same failure of due diligence in working out their own premises. Another thing that I've found fascinating in this is the attitude of the authorities and the bank managers who ran the bank. They didn't seem to understand that their treatment of the convicts and of the colony in general would generate such hatred of the community and the logical response of the community. And at one point, when a sexy, very brazen convict woman went into the bank with stolen notes and tried to get them exchanged, the bank teller, who was a member of the upper classes, of course, or the middle to upper classes, he suggested that she should have been behaving more responsibly and helping the bank get back its money. And she said to him, "Nobody cares about the bank being robbed. In fact, everyone is rather pleased about it." To which he responded, "Is the bank disliked?" To which I can only respond in the vernacular of my offspring, "Duh?" I mean, seriously. In fact, it rather reminds me of the recent situation with Alan Jones and his appalling comments about Julia Gillard. And when the community took action, his bewilderment and outrage that people could behave this way against him. It's also interesting, it shows us, gives us insight into the power of the people. We have a political voice today. We have it through our vote, through our ability to write letters to companies and to newspapers, and even in our ability to take action against someone like Alan Jones. In those days, the people had no political voice. They were illiterate, they had no vote, they had no power. But what was so fascinating is they came together and they found their voice, and the voice lay in their silence. And that silence nearly broke the bank. It says a lot about business today, doesn't it? We can also get insights into ourselves. When Breaking the Bank came out, my literary agent was approached by a movie director who said to her that she was American and had lived in Australia for 10 years, and reading Breaking the Bank was the first time she really understood the makings of the Australian psyche, particularly the tall poppy syndrome and pulling them down to size. Yet we can see in the story of the bank robbery how this anti-elitism has its good side and its bad side. In the colonial community, these people came together in the face of a corrupt authority, and even when they were at risk of their own necks, because some of these receivers who said nothing actually died on the penal settlements. But enough of the insights, the profound stories. What about the money? What happened with the money? As you can imagine, the notes themselves quickly became only of black market value and soon had no value at all. The coins, however, were easier to move within the community. But if you're thinking of investing in scuba diving equipment or metal detection tools, the source of the quote I said at the start, somewhere near the water's edge in one of the small bays on the north shore of Sydney Harbour, is a website called Treasure Enterprises of New South Wales. As a historian, I can tell you that the credibility of that website is just about zilch. However, there were an awful lot of coins and an awful lot of bags of coins, and they did have to hide them somewhere. And there was talk at the time that maybe they hid some of them in Cockle Bay. Do any of you know what Cockle Bay is called today? Darling Harbour. So next time you go to Darling Harbour, look across into the water and remind yourself, think about Australia's greatest bank robbery. Is that a glitter in the water you can see? We can all but dream. Thank you.